Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, Dark Succubus. The man who rules the world is tempted by a sultry succubus in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Dark Succubus in paperback or pre-order on Kindle Unlimited today. I was watching a Fourth Age video where your Sana Amanat was alleged to have made a statement at one of these publishing conferences for YA fiction where she said that comic shops were inaccessible boys' clubs that made efforts to exclude women back in the 1980s. Now, I was a teenager back in the 1980s, and I would go out with my brother to many comic shops all across New York City, like Forbidden Planet in Union Square, like Village Comics down in the Village, and Forbidden Planet at 59th Street and Lexington Avenue. And I would also go to other comic shops in the 90s like Jim Hanley's Universe down in Midtown Manhattan, or I would go to Adams comic shops in the early 2000s that was on 170th Street. And I went to all of these comic shops, and they were never inaccessible boys clubs that had made efforts to exclude women. In fact, all of those shops were open to everyone. And every time I would go to a comic shop, I would see men, women, boys, and girls of all ages coming to that comic shop, and they would go there to pick up their comics. They would go there to buy superhero-related merchandise like t-shirts, action figures, and many would go there to buy specialty items like manga or anime VHSs, or later in the 2000s they would go there to buy anime DVDs, and there was no problem with anyone having access to those shops. In fact, many of those shop owners were eager to have the business of women because that meant that they were going to spend more money, because usually when women come to a comic shop, they're not just buying for their boyfriends, they like superheroes too, and they spend more money than the guys on superhero and superhero related merchandise. So when a woman comes into the store, a business owner, a comic shop owner, knows that that's money in the bank because they will buy more, and they will also not only buy the superhero related merchandise, but sometimes they will buy the more expensive manga and anime stuff, or they will come in and they'll buy the statues and other merchandise in the comic shop. So when I listen to Sana Amanat make that statement, it's another one of the lies she wants to promote in order to push her social justice narrative, one that can be easily refuted by someone who grew up during the 1980s. And as someone who did grow up during the 1980s and can remember going down to those comic shops like Forbidden Planet, like Jim Hanley's Universe, like Village Comics, and like Adams Comics, I know that comic shops are not these inaccessible boys clubs that made efforts to exclude women. In fact, it's actually illegal for a comic shop to go out here and exclude women because we have federal laws that prevent that type of discrimination. So that argument that your Sana Amanat is making regarding comic shops being boys clubs, this is an out and out lie that this woman is telling, and it shows why your Sana Amanat should not be the Vice President of Content and Character Development, because it's clear to me that your Sana Amanat does not have much in terms of character, because any woman with character would not sit there and tell a bold-faced lie to people at a publishing conference that represents a product like Marvel Comics. Now, the reason why comics are having a hard time being sold these days has nothing to do with comic shops being these so-called inaccessible boys clubs. No, the reason why comics are having a hard time being sold is due to bad business decisions made by Marvel in the 1990s. Now, in the 1990s, Marvel made the decision to purchase Heroes World, and when they made the decision to buy Heroes World, this led to the complete collapse of the distribution system for comics, because comics decided to go into the direct market and sell directly to the stores. And when you go with the direct market, what happened was the products went from being a part of a returnable business model to a non-returnable business model. And most retailers wound up balking at that whole idea of non-returnability, especially grocery stores, drugstores, supermarkets, and big box stores like Walmart at the time and Target. They all balked at the idea of picking up a product that would be non-returnable. And this is one of the reasons why comics had a hard time selling. In between the purchase of Heroes World with distribution and the non-returnability of comics, this is what led to the complete decline of the comic book industry, and it led to the complete collapse of the comic book industry, compounded with the fall of the speculator boom of the 1990s. All of these things were the reason why the whole comic book collectability medium fell completely into decline, and why comic book sales fell overall. They fell because of that distribution issue, and those distribution issues still continue to plague the comic book industry, because now we only have one comic book distributor, Diamond Comics, and with Diamond Comics being the only distributor for comics, they insist on comics being non-returnable. And because comics are a non-returnable item, this is why most retailers balk at making orders for them or trying to make efforts to create shelf space for them. Because when it comes down to everything in retail, you have to give those retailers a guarantee that the product will be returnable, or they will have no incentive to stock your product. Because if you don't have returnability, you cannot get a book in a system like Barnes & Noble, you can't get a book on a system like Amazon, and you can't get distribution to places like the Hudson Group. Because in order to get that distribution, you have to give those retailers a incentive to stock your books, and returnability gives them that incentive to stock a book. Because if that retailer knows they can pack up all the unsold issues and return them for credit on next month's issues, that gives them incentive to carve out a space in their retail establishment for those items. And those retailers don't have that incentive because Marvel insists on continuing to push the non-returnable distribution model, and that is why their sales are an all-time low. That compounded with much of the content they produce being virtually unreadable, because most Marvel comics these days, they are not well-crafted stories, they do not feature the characters that are well developed, and your son Amanat, she wants to deflect from all that by talking about how comic shops are inaccessible boys clubs, when in actuality she is creating content that just does not generate the demand from retailers to give them incentive to want to order it or stock it. And she doesn't want to deal with the fact that Diamond is not a good distributor, because their archaic business model does not help give retailers an incentive to go out here and purchase their products. Because when it comes down to Diamond, their terms just aren't what retailers like drugstores, supermarkets, and grocery stores want to see as related to retail. What they want is returnability, and if they can get returnability, then they will have an incentive to go stock comics again. But your son Amanat, she's not going to talk about that. Instead, she's going to push a social justice argument stating that in the 1980s, comic shops were these inaccessible boys clubs, and this is an out and out lie, and it's a lie that needs to be called out by those of us who grew up in the 1980s, those of us who did go to comic shops, and those of us who saw comics not only in comic shops in times like 1987, 88, 89, when I was buying comics. We saw them not only in the comic shops, but we also saw them in grocery stores and supermarkets and drugstores. So comics were always accessible to everyone either in a comic shop or a grocery store. But the real reason why comics are having a hard time being sold is primarily due to the collapse of one, distribution, and two, these days, because the comic book publishers publish comics that the customer just has no interest in reading, because most comic publishers these days, like your son Amanat, they want to go out here and push these unethical social justice narratives and promote propaganda in between the pages of their comics. And this is why their comics aren't selling at comic shops, many of which believe that this is the only thing that they can stock on their shelves, because if they don't order certain books, what will happen is they can't get other books or they can't get variants. And this is why, or in the case of Marvel, they overship bad books and then charge you for postage. So the whole industry has problems, but they want to make this argument saying that it's an inaccessible boys club, when the irony is it's people like your son Amanat and many of her social justice cronies who are making the comic book industry inaccessible. And it's these people who are creating this far left fiefdom that are making comics inaccessible to everyone, because they want to create this elite club where they dictate who goes and is able to access their comics. And because we have these people creating a fiefdom, this is why comics are becoming inaccessible to readers of all ages, and people are finding alternatives to go and read about fantastic adventures. And what's really sad is that this vice president of content and character development clearly shows that she has no character and she has no integrity. And this is the person who's supposed to be running Marvel, and it shows that she doesn't stand for the same concepts of truth, justice, honor, and respect that the superheroes that she is supposed to be selling stand for. Because when you can sit there and lie to an audience of people at a publishing conference, it shows, again, you are not the right person to be running Marvel. And under this woman's leadership, it's clear to me this is the reason why Marvel is running into the ground, because the woman running Marvel does not stand for the same moral principles that the heroes in the comics stand for. And because she doesn't stand for the same principles that the heroes stand for, this is why Marvel's business has been struggling for the last 3 to 4 years, and I believe it's going to wind up getting worse before it gets better, and eventually it's going to wind up collapsing, because as long as you have someone this unethical running Marvel, Marvel is going to wind up run straight into the ground. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications that feature strong heroes and heroines like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, the Spinsterella trilogy, and the Thetas, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. There you will get my paperbacks and ebooks available for sale. And if you want to help me pay to fund the first ISIS graphic novel, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam Goddess of. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a demonic dominatrix in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Goddess of in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.